The gutters of medieval cities often ran red by noon. Blood from slaughtered cattle spilled into streams, the stench thick enough to make nobles retch from their balconies. And yet, without this horror, no one ate. Such was the price of sustenance. Today you will learn how brutal and indispensable the work of a medieval butcher truly was. From the blood-soaked dawn slaughters and the suffocating stench of meat stalls, to the strict guild rituals, deadly tools, and hidden power dynamics that define this grim profession. In the crowded alleys of medieval towns, where pigs rooted through refuse and market stalls steamed with the breath of the living and the dying, the butcher stood as a figure both feared and necessary. Wrapped in an apron stiff with blood, hands calloused from years of slaughter and salt, he was the lifeline of urban survival. A craftsman whose labor fed the city yet chained him to its filth. Among the raucous cries of fishmongers and the pungent haze of tanneries, his stall exhaled the thick scent of iron and fat, drawing both hunger and disgust from those who passed. Meat in the Middle Ages was more than food. It was a commodity of status, offered in fatty slabs to nobles and city elites, while offal and bone made their way to peasants and servants. The butcher's work linked him to every layer of society, yet it isolated him just as cruelly. His shop might sit beside the baker's or brewer's, but few would invite him to their table. Blood stained not only his garments, but the perception of his soul. Still, his trade carried weight. In cities like Prague, London, and Florence, butchers often marched directly behind magistrates during civic parades, ranked above goldsmiths and scribes, a sign that their hands, though soaked in gore, sustained the very structure of daily life. They supplied kitchens, equipped candle makers with tallow, and furnished tanners with hides, ensuring that no part of the animal went to waste. Through this network, the butcher became a silent pillar of the medieval economy. Yet the road to becoming a butcher was long, grueling, and stained with more than just blood. It began in silence, in sweeping straw floors sticky with rot, in sharpening another man's blade, and in carrying buckets too heavy for a child's back. Before a man could wear the apron, he had to endure the weight of it. That weight began in boyhood, when the apprentice entered the butcher's stall not as a student of trade, but as a servant to its grime. From dawn to dusk, he scrubbed floors soaked in gore, emptied buckets sloshing with congealed blood, and scoured knives until his hands blistered beneath the cold sting of brine. His tasks were not designed to teach, but to harden, to test whether he could stomach the stink of gut and rot without flinching, whether his body could endure the endless rhythm of lifting, scraping, hauling, and enduring. The journeyman stage came only after years of silent obedience. By then, he could recognize the tremble in a pig's haunch that warned of a coming kick, feel the grain of fat through hide with practiced fingers, and strike true with a blade sharpened not only by stone, but by repetition. Under his master's watchful gaze, he learned the delicate choreography of disassembly, how to gut cleanly, peel hide from flesh in a single pull, and hang meat without wasting a single usable part. Each gesture was a lesson passed down through hands more than words, taught not in classrooms, but in stalls where the air itself tasted of salt, smoke, and slow decay. Only when the journeyman proved his precision, strength, and restraint, and when a space opened within the town's tightly regulated market, was he permitted to test for mastery. That test was no mere formality. A future master might be ordered to slaughter a bull before the town elders, to carve swine into standard cuts with speed and symmetry, or to prepare poultry so neatly it seemed untouched by death. Passing meant more than skill. It meant joining the Czech, the guild, and gaining a place within a profession. Becoming a member of the guild gave a butcher more than just pride. It gave him protection, control over prices, and a fixed place among the stalls of the town. His name was added to the list of licensed vendors, and his right to sell was backed by law. But these privileges came with strict rules. The number of butcher shops was often limited, and a master without a stall had to wait, sometimes for years, until another died, retired, or broke the guild's code. Until then, he might work under another master or rent a corner of someone else's stand, hoping for the day his own wooden sign would hang above blood-worn stones. Even after winning a stall, daily life was far from easy. The butcher's work began long before sunrise, in places far from the market square. He often traveled to village fairs or farms where he chose cattle, pigs, and sheep with a trained eye. Only the strongest and healthiest would do. A mistake meant spoiled meat, angry customers, and punishment from the guild. With his staff and dogs, he drove the animals through muddy roads back to the town, a dangerous journey full of noise, fear, and sudden chaos if the animals panicked. Once inside the city gates, the real labor began. Butchers were only allowed to kill animals in certain places, usually near rivers or outside the town walls. There, in cold air and damp mud, they tied the animal tight and struck with a heavy hammer to stun it. Then came the long knife, sharp as ice, cutting deep through skin and vein. Blood poured onto the ground or into buckets, saved for sausages or soup for the poor. The work had to be fast. Meat spoiled quickly, and there were no ice houses or clean water to slow the rot. The butcher worked by feel, his hands knowing each cut. Beside him, helpers carried off guts, cleaned hides, and stacked the fresh meat for sale. All of it, even the smallest piece, had its use. In this way, nothing went to waste. Yet no matter how skilled he became, the butcher remained tied to a trade that left its mark on every inch of his skin. Scars formed where blades had slipped, where cleavers had bitten deep through bone and nearly into flesh. Calluses covered the palms, but they offered little protection when cold steel met soft skin or when rough hides fought back. A butcher's body told the story of his years: cuts on his hands, burns from hot water, aching joints from lifting heavy meat. The pain became part of the rhythm, just like the sound of dripping blood or the crack of bones beneath the block. His clothes, though washed each night, never lost the smell. Blood dried into the threads, and fat soaked into the seams. In summer, flies swarmed the shop, drawn by the heat and the smell of flesh. In winter, fingers stiffened from cold as water froze in the buckets, and knives slipped too easily from numb hands. The butcher's stall was not a place of rest. It was a battlefield, one he faced daily with little thanks and no relief. Work was done in tight spaces, side by side with helpers who moved fast, spoke little, and kept their eyes low. Mistakes were costly. A slip could mean a deep gash, or worse. One wrong cut could spoil an entire side of meat. Blood made the floors slick, and straw scattered to catch it became soaked and rotten by midday. Even the strongest man had to be careful, because the danger came not just from animals or tools, but from the filth that clung to everything. In those conditions, wounds healed slowly. Infection was common. A small cut could swell, turn dark, and cost a finger, or a life. The butcher knew these risks. He had seen others grow sick from the filth or from the animals themselves. Some diseases passed from beasts to men, and no one yet knew the names of these hidden killers. Still, the work could not stop, because the people needed meat. Each morning, once the killing was done and the meat prepared, the butcher made his way to the market. With carts full of fresh cuts, buckets of organs, and bundles of sausage, he entered the narrow lane where butchers sold side by side. These stalls, often made of wood or stone, lined special streets called meat alleys, dark, damp places that stank of smoke, salt, and blood. Here, the air was thick and heavy, and the noise of buyers shouting mixed with the chop of cleavers and the low grumble of merchants calling their prices. Some shops were nothing more than tables beneath cloth roofs, but others were part of larger halls, deep, sunken buildings built to stay cool, where walls were stained dark from years of blood. The butcher's place was his pride. Behind the counter, his goods were arranged in careful order. Thick slabs of beef hung from iron hooks. Sausages were piled in coils. Livers, kidneys, hearts, and tongues lay on fresh straw. A barrel of blood stood nearby, ready to be turned into black pudding or soup for the poor. Rich buyers came first. A cook from a noble house might ask for the best roast, a veal shoulder, or a tenderloin hidden behind the stall. These buyers expected clean cuts, a quiet word, and no waiting. For them, the butcher saved his best. The poor came later, asking for bones, skin, or fat. Anything cheap, but filling. And the butcher gave it. Not because he was kind, but because waste meant lost coin, and even scraps had value. Still, he had to be careful. If the meat smelled wrong, if it spoiled too soon, the town officials would come. There were rules now, new ones, harsh ones. Selling bad meat could bring fines, or worse, shame. A butcher caught cheating might be tied to a post with rotten meat around his neck. His shop could be closed and his name ruined. So when the last piece of meat left the counter and the noise of the market began to fade, the butcher stayed behind to clean. His tools, worn but trusted, were soaked in fat and grit. The floor was covered with straw soaked in blood, and every surface needed wiping before the sun set. Buckets of water, often dark and cold, were poured over tables and stones, and fresh straw was spread to cover the stains. The knives were sharpened again, not for show, but because tomorrow they must cut just as fast and clean. What could not be sold fresh was packed in salt. This simple act, rubbing each side of meat, layer after layer, until the crystals turned red, kept hunger away through the week. Barrels filled with salted pork or beef were sealed and stored in cool corners, away from sun and heat. It was the only way to save food in a time without ice. Smokehouses nearby turned other cuts into hams and sausages, hanging them high where fires burned slow and steady. Nothing was wasted, not the blood, not the skin, not even the bones. At home, the butcher's wife might count coins, measure flour, or prepare a broth from scraps brought back from the stall. Children, if old enough, helped wash rags or peel garlic for sausage stuffing. In many families, the whole house worked as part of the trade. The stall belonged to the man, but the trade belonged to them all. Sometimes the business passed from father to son, but only if the son was strong enough to carry the weight, not just of meat, but of duty and blood. The guild, too, was watching. Dues had to be paid. Rules followed. If a man grew lazy, dishonest, or careless, it was not only the town that punished him. The other butchers, his own brothers in the trade, could shut him out. And for a man whose hands smelled of blood and iron, there were few other paths to walk. He walked that path every day, no matter the season. In summer, the heat clung to his skin like grease, mixing with a heavy smell of meat and sweat until it became something foul and hard to ignore. Flies gathered in clouds, settling on flesh, on hands, on faces. The work did not stop. Even as the air grew thick and the meat spoiled faster, he swung his cleaver, wiped his brow, and kept selling. Salt helped slow the rot, but time was always against him. Each hour lost could mean a whole cut wasted. In winter, the world grew still and sharp. Water froze in buckets, and the blood turned thick before it touched the ground. His fingers cracked from the cold, and his breath hung heavy in the dark. Still, animals had to be slaughtered, meat had to be sold, and buyers came wrapped in cloaks, stamping their feet as they pointed to what they needed. The butcher's blade did not wait for warmth. Cold slowed him, but it never stopped him. Day after day, his body paid the price. Lifting, chopping, dragging. It wore down his shoulders, bent his back, and left his legs aching long into the night. Sleep brought little rest. Some wounds healed, others stayed. His hands shook more than they once did, and the pain in his joints made it harder to work fast. But rest meant no coin, and no coin meant no food, not just for him, but for everyone under his roof. Still, he carried on, not out of pride and not for glory, but because the stall was his place and the meat was his task. A man whose labor fed many, but left him stained in ways no water could wash clean. Even when he left the market and walked the narrow streets toward home, His presence lingered in the air long after he passed. People made space for him without words, not from fear, but from quiet discomfort. Mothers pulled their children close, merchants turned their heads, and dogs sniffed with a mix of hunger and confusion. His clothes, no matter how often washed, carried the scent of his labor, thick with iron, sour with fat, sharp with rot. He soaked his hands in vinegar, rubbed them with salt, burned sage, and boiled his apron in ash water, but the smell always returned. It had sunk deep into his skin, into his beard, into every crease of his weathered palms. The longer he worked, the more he carried it, a scent not of dirt, but of something older and harder to forget. He noticed the glances, the wrinkled noses, the subtle steps back. No one shouted or cursed. No one needed to. Respect sat beside revulsion, and both shaped how the town saw him. He was not feared like a hangman, nor loved like a baker, but something in between, necessary, skilled, and always watched. His knives, so sharp they could part hide from flesh in a single pull, hung openly on the stall wall. Yet to others they were not tools, but reminders. Of death, of blood, of things most wished hidden behind stone and door. His hands, steady, cracked, roughened by salt and years, were the hands that ended life. And even if that life was meant to feed a dozen mouths, the act itself left a shadow. Some whispered that butchers became hard, cruel, or strange with time. Others believed the smell they carried came not from meat, but from the soul, stained by too much killing. These thoughts were never spoken aloud, yet they drifted like smoke through streets and squares. His place in the market was marked, his home known, but his name carried a weight that never fully lifted. The church often placed butchers near the back. In some towns, they could not testify in court or join certain councils. They lived near the tanners, near the dung pits, where the city's waste ran thick and dark. And still, when feast days came and oxen were needed, when famine threatened and every scrap counted, they came to him. They came not just for meat, but for order, for the quiet promise that nothing spoiled would reach their mouths. That promise was guarded not only by the butcher's skill, but by the strict hand of the guild. Long before markets filled with buyers and before smoke rose from the first fire, the guild set its rules. These were not suggestions. They were commands, written in fines, in loss of license, and sometimes in public shame. A butcher who cheated his customers or sold bad cuts did more than risk coin. He risked everything. The guild watched closely. It knew that the power of the trade depended on trust. Rotten meat, if sold, could sicken a family. Hidden bones in a sausage could cost a child their teeth. Even one mistake could stain the name of every butcher in the street. So, when one of them lied, the punishment came fast and loud. In some towns, the man was tied to a post in the market with spoiled meat strung around his neck. In others, his stall was torn down by his peers. Once cast out, few could return. The market held no place for the unclean. There were written laws, too, passed by councils and read aloud by town criers. No meat could be sold from sick animals. No butcher could raise prices without cause. No blood could be poured into the streets. These rules did not come from kindness. They were born from need, from the memory of illness, hunger, and plague. And the butcher, for all his blood and toil, stood at the center of that fragile line between safety and sickness. He followed the rules not only to keep his place, but to hold his head high. His knives were sharp. His stall, though thick with grease and bone, was clean by the standards of the time. In that narrow stall between filth and hunger, he stood as both provider and protector. But that duty came at a heavy cost, carved slowly into his flesh by years of work that never softened. The same knife that sliced neatly through hide could slip in an instant, cutting into his own skin with the same ease. Wounds were common. Deep cuts from cleavers, bruises from slipped hammers, burns from boiling water used to clean hides or soften pigskin. At first, he wrapped them in cloth and ignored the sting. But over time, small injuries festered, and pain settled deep into joints, fingers, and spine. never quite leaving, even in sleep. Infection was a constant threat. With no knowledge of germs and no way to disinfect tools beyond fire or salt, a minor scrape could swell into fever. Sometimes the fingers went black. Sometimes the skin tore open. And sometimes a man who had worked the stall for decades died from a wound no wider than a thumbprint. The blood of animals mixed too easily with that of men. Diseases passed from hide to hand, from bone to breath, long before doctors knew how or why. He had seen it happen. A fellow butcher nicked his hand while gutting a calf. Days later, he was gone, buried behind the chapel with no coin left for a headstone. Another grew sick after working with cattle marked by strange sores. No one spoke the words, but all who worked the knife felt it, the quiet fear of something hiding in the blood, something the salt could not kill and the fire could not burn away. Still, the butcher kept working, because the city never stopped eating. His job was not safe, nor clean, nor praised, but it was his, and through it he kept hunger from the doors of peoples. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.